As I'm doing this, it's July of 2020, and we are still effectively in the midst of the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic. When COVID first hit, you would hear all the stories about people who had loved ones who were sick or who were old, and how there were strict hospital regulations that prevented people from being able to see their loved ones, especially those who were terminal. And we've heard stories about people having to say their goodbyes over FaceTime or walkie-talkie even. Even close to home here, my brother-in-law on my wife's side, his wife lost her mother a few months into this pandemic, not from COVID, but due to the restrictions, they had to limit, who could be in the hospital, and they also had to limit who could be at the ceremony afterwards. And so they had to do a Zoom funeral, essentially, with only immediate family present. You hear all these stories and you hear all the difficulties, and you always kind of think to yourself, hopefully that doesn't happen to me, or hopefully I don't have to experience that. In my sister's case, she was sort of unofficially on lockdown before the official COVID-19 lockdown in the province of Ontario in Canada. Because of her diagnosis, she had to stay out of the sun. And at the same time, she was dealing with a couple of other ailments, rheumatoid arthritis and diabetes, and the arthritis in particular really crippled up her hands and her knees with pain, made it hard for her to get around. And so combine that with her diagnosis, and she spent most of her time at home, and she had to be very careful who she associated with. Had to make sure that she social distanced because she was very high risk for COVID-19. Then when we got her final prognosis, so to speak, when we were told that she had days to weeks left, I remember it was on a Friday. I believe it was Friday, July the 3rd. We'd gotten the prognosis the previous day, and I wanted to try to get her home care, because even though her cognitive by that point was not, where it once was, she still was able to tell us that she wanted to be home. And so, knowing the restrictions that existed because of COVID, I wanted to try to get her home care. I wanted her to be around, her loved ones, be around her circle. And this is when I discovered the difficulties when it came to COVID, particularly in a smaller town, which is where they live. Getting proper help, getting personal support workers, getting in-home nurse care, even during the best of times, is very difficult in a small town. And you can imagine how it is during a period such as what we're living in with COVID-19. I spent hours on the phone, first trying to get care covered by insurance, covered by Ontario insurance, and was effectively told that it would be at least a week before anybody would be available. And we knew, given her prognosis, that she needed somebody immediately. At that point, she wasn't eating, she wasn't drinking, she wasn't taking her medication. She needed proper care. Then I decided, okay, I'm going to get private care, meaning I'll pay for it. And I guess I'm spoiled coming from a place like Toronto, where if you're willing to pay for it, you can get it quickly. There's lots of availability. In a smaller town, that's not so much the case, whether it's private or not. And so when I reached out looking to get a private nurse and a private PSW, first I was told, okay, we'll have somebody there the next day, meaning we'll have somebody there Saturday. Then I got an email, and it's almost a comedy type situation. I got an email saying that the only available nurse in the whole area who was going to come the next day, her car broke down and she would be unable to come. One nurse, and we were told they would be unable to come. And I offered to get them a driver. I offered to pick them up, but I was effectively shut down. I said they couldn't come. So now here we were, unable to get government assisted care, unable to get private care, and that left us with a decision. Do we keep my sister at home and try to take care of her the best we can? Her husband at that point was not sleeping, because if he wasn't taking care of her during the day, at night he was keeping watch on her to make sure that she didn't, fall out of bed or off the couch or wherever she was. So we called palliative care. And again, due to COVID, we were told their rules. And their rules were 1 visitor per day total. And if you were considered end of life, you could have 2 visitors per day total. In my sister's case, there were 3 people that were close enough to her that we knew she'd want them all to be there for her at the end. And that was myself, her husband, and my mother. And so obviously when you're told 2 people per day total, and you would like to accommodate at least 3, it can be very challenging. This is when we came to a realization, and this is a realization that I think a lot of people need to come to in a similar situation. We came to realize that we were putting our own needs first. We were putting our own wants first. We were putting our desire to be close to my sister ahead of what she needed at that time. So we made the difficult decision to put her into palliative so that she could get proper care. She could have 24-hour nursing care, 24-hour PSW care. And then, as it turned out, I guess fortunately, because there weren't a lot of people in that hospital at that time, we were able to get them to slightly bend the rules for us so that they would allow 2 people at a time during the day as opposed to 2 people total. And so we were able to rotate. I would go in with my sister's husband, and then I would go in with my mother, and then he would go in with my mother. Went in on a rotation like that. Not the most ideal situation, but it's what we had to deal with. Then when we knew that the end was near, I talked to my brother-in-law about the idea of, should we bring her home? My mother had told me about a friend of hers whose husband was in that same facility, and they brought him home when the end was coming, and they were able to surround him with the whole family at home. So we talked about that, but again, we would require a nurse, we would require a PSW, and again, even calling around for private care, the availability just wasn't there, partly due to being in a small town, partly being due to COVID. And so we ultimately kept her in palliative until she passed. And myself and my brother-in-law were there with her when that happened. I'm kind of torn on the whole handling of COVID in this aspect. On the one hand, I think that cases, particularly in the province of Ontario, Canada, have been contained because of government regulation and because people are obeying the rules. People are social distancing, people are staying in lockdown, people are wearing masks, and so that's great. At the same time, the town where this all took place, my hometown, at that time there were no new daily cases, and from what I understand, there were no new active cases, or I shouldn't say just no active cases, period. And so part of me thought, couldn't they bend a little bit? Couldn't they get a 3rd person in? You had to be masked up to be in there. They put a gown and gloves on you when you got in there, and goggles. You had to sanitize your hands when you came and went. You had to sign a waiver when you entered, acknowledging that you hadn't been out of the country and all of that. Precautions were there, and so I really wanted to get a 3rd person in there so all 3 of us could be there for my sister. But like I said, it's because we follow guidelines that we've been able to, up to this point, contain this virus. So I guess that's my COVID story. I'm thankful that I could be there with my sister at the end. I'm thankful that we didn't have to rely on iPads or walkie-talkies or anything like that. But like I said, I wish we could have gotten a third person in. That's maybe under the circumstances, I was asking too much. And like I said, maybe the mistake is that I was putting my needs or the needs of my mother or my brother-in-law ahead of the needs of my sister.